I'm Kathy Oleson. So I'm the current dean of the faculty and a professor of psychology. I came to Reed in 1995. Actually, Nigel and I both started the same year at Reed at that time. I am a social psychologist by training. So when I teach, I'm not teaching right now as dean of the faculty, but when I teach introductory psychology, I teach social psychology, I teach statistics in the psychology department, and then I teach upper level classes on stereotyping and prejudice, on interpersonal perception, and other things.
And my name is Nigel Nicholson. As Kathy said, I came in 95 as well. So we've both been here a good chunk of our lives, our 27th year, I think. I am in the Greek, Latin, and Mediterranean Studies program. And I also teach in the first year humanities program, Hum 110, most years. So that means apart from teaching Hum 110, I teach Latin and Greek classes, language classes, literature classes, culture classes. Some of them are in Latin and Greek. Some of them are in translation.
As Nigel mentioned, is like one of the key thing that unites all Reed's graduate is the Hum 110 experience. That is like the class that everyone must take, no matter if they're, philosophy, psychology, or physics majors. So what is Hum 110, Humanities 110, for those who don't know the initials? How has it been changing the past few years? And do you anticipate any further changes for Humanities 110? And by the way, it's one of our oldest class. We have this class since, I think, at least 1940s. I could be wrong, but it's been here for a very, very long time.
This is one of our breadth requirements. It's a special breadth requirement. It's basically a college prep class. It's a writing training class. It helps develop your skills of speaking in seminars, reading, preparation in general. It's a year-long class. It's worth 3 units. And content-wise, it's an in-depth study of the humanities broadly written. This means that, there's a really nice conversation that goes on above and beyond your individual class, right? So I have a class of 16, 17 students, and we meet for 3 hours a week, and we talk about materials, whatever's on the syllabus, and we do our writing in that context and so on. But the students also talk with their dorm mates and their friends and people they have dinner with and so on. And the different conferences often talk about different things in different ways, and you get this wonderful kind of cross-fertilization.
In my info session, I mentioned a lot that like your first 2 years at Reed are like your exploration year. It's meant to like discover it. You meant to like take Humanities 110 with all your classmates, and also, branch out, right, before you start kind of focusing on your thesis and things like that. Kathy, I would love to hear, what your thoughts are on like the way that we approach the general distribution requirements. What is that system like at Reed, and why do we have it like that, and how does it serve the students and their education in the first few years?
We've got this Humanities 110 requirement that everyone does, and then we have these kind of broad group distribution requirements. So we have some that's in arts and literature, we've got kind of social sciences, and we have math and natural sciences and psychology. So kind of 3 different kind of broad groupings. And I mean, for me, college, it's a time where you're trying to learn about a lot of different things, trying to figure out if there's what you want to specialize in. So at Reed, you'll ultimately do a thesis in some area. But the distribution requirements are to give you kind of broad knowledge of different areas, different academic areas. But they also teach you different approaches to questions. So, in group 3, psychology is kind of in the lab science group. You're going to be learning about testing hypotheses and collecting data and analyzing data. So sort of learning those approaches to questions. Other things, you're going to be learning how to take a text and read it carefully and do a close reading of it and to do interpretations of that. So you have different skills that you're learning in these different areas. So I guess I see our distribution requirements as a way to expose you to the content of lots of different ideas, but also to expose you to lots of different methods for kind of approaching ideas.
How do you describe like Reed approaches to advising? How do we help them kind of figure out what it is that they want to study, pursue, pick their courses?
When you come in, you're assigned an academic advisor. It's a member of the faculty. In most cases, you sit down with your advisor, and people have several majors they're trying to keep open, and it's usually pretty easy to do that, right? So it gets a little tricky if they come in and they say, I want to be either a biochem major, or a political science major or a theater major or something, right? But normally they're sort of more clustered together a bit, right? But whoever it is, we sit down with the student, and particularly something like Humanities, because it's prep for a lot of different majors, is actually a really efficient way to go. The large science classes, the intro science classes, right, are important for a lot of different majors, and a good way to start. I mean, in some ways, it's just not that hard to plan a coherent first year that leaves you ready to, experiment further in your second year and make an informed choice. At a college like Reed that, has really quite a lot of resources for you, right? The challenge is often less actually using the resources than knowing about them in the first place, right? And so your advisor is one of those people, your house advisor is another one, resident director, and so on. But one of those people who can help get you in touch with the kind of offices and so on that can help you with what you need, or put you in touch with things that you want.
The other thing I guess I would add about your advisor is they can also help you with kind of bigger picture kinds of things. So, when actually, as dean, I still have my academic advisees. I haven't gotten new ones, but I've kind of been there. I now just have a few that are left. Most of them are kind of graduating this year. So, but they'll, when they come in, they'll sort of say, are you thinking about studying abroad? Let's think about when you might do that. And kind of we'll look at their schedule. So we'll talk about those big questions. Or what do you want to do in the summer after your first year? Are there internships that you want to look into, or working in somebody's lab, or are you going to go back to your parents' house? Are you going to maybe stay in Portland? And so really kind of having those big things that you're kind of keeping those things in mind as you're helping them plan more long-term.
We have questions from families right now. How do students incorporate study abroad into their education? For some, when you look at the requirements, it looks like you have a lot of requirements for a lot of different subjects and distributions and groups. So how do they manage to do that and still do study abroad and graduate within 4 years?
Most students, if they study abroad, they do it their sophomore or their junior year. So they might do it second semester sophomore year or first semester of their junior year. Sometimes they'll go for a year, but they often students will go for a semester. And there's some things where like your first year, you kind of have the humanities courses, which is all the first year, and your senior year, you've got your thesis, which is the whole thing. But the 2 years in between, I think you can really think about fitting that in.
You plan ahead enough, and you recognize that you cannot have everything, right? You can't stay at Reed and go abroad, right? You can't maybe take that class that happens in the term when you go abroad, but you can take a different class when you come back, right? I think as long as one's realistic about it, there's really great options. We have a really nice suite of places to go to.
Reed doesn't offer any major that other schools don't offer: psychology, classic, history, right? The sciences. And yet we have produced a prodigious number of students who've gone on to earn PhDs in a variety number of fields. I think we're top 4, behind Caltech and MIT and Swarthmore once in a while, in terms of like the PhD per capita productions. So, how does the Reed education, the seminars, how does that translate into such a prodigious rate of like graduate school, PhDs, and how does that differ from students who might be looking at like other bigger R1 research school, for example?
For me, I think what we call the conference method, or kind of doing a small seminar discussion class, and I think the conference method really brings together. You come in, you're working together to look at some topic. You need to be really prepared. You need to think deeply about it. You need to collectively look at these questions. To me, those are the kinds of skills that if you went on to graduate school, that's what you would be doing in a graduate level class. You would be reading things deeply. You would be having these conversations. You'd be doing a lot of the skills that Nigel talked about in Hume, and during writing and critical thinking. And I don't know, to me, it actually is the kinds of things you would be doing if you were in graduate school. So I think it prepares you really well for that.
There's a lot of pieces to this, so I'm probably going to bang on a little bit. I think start with, I think thesis is really key here, right? So part of what's interesting about senior thesis here is that everybody does one. And this is very, very unusual. You know, you can count on one hand the number of schools where this is true. What it means is that the whole curriculum has to prepare students for thesis. And so the grad schools then, you know, have these applicants who have a lot of direct research experience. And that is unusual. I think we have a pretty extraordinary research faculty, but what they do is they work with students. Part of the question was, how would it be different from a big research university? So if you're an extraordinary researcher at a big university, you are, quote, rewarded by not teaching students, right? So the two are set up as somehow in opposition, right? So the better you are at research, the less you're going to teach, right? This is just a fact, right? We all teach the same here, right? And, the folks who've become really sort of, famous researchers, they teach as much as anybody else, right? They have students in their labs. And of course, the students they have in their labs are undergraduates, right? You may go to an R1 and think, wow, you know, there's an enormous set of labs there, but you're not going to be in them because grad students are going to be in them, right? Here, you know, the faculty work with undergrads. That's who sort of, you know, serve as our kind of thought partners apart from each other, right? So you're much closer to it.
For those students and families who might not be very familiar with it, you know, what is a senior thesis? You know, why do we require it? And if you can, you know, talk about from your previous students, you know, what are some theses that stood out to you as like especially interesting or it's memorable, and how were they conducted by your students?
From the student's perspective, basically you're coming in to read, and so you end up kind of getting, you know, you're doing this kind of broad learning, and then you're getting into your major. And then for your senior year, you come up with some question that you want to focus on for that year. And so in psychology, that would be probably a research, some kind of experimental study or some kind of empirical project that you're going to do. And so you'd come up with a question, and you need to think about what's the way I'm going to look at that. So let's say in social psychology, in my field, you probably would have to design some kind of experiment to look at that. And you would go through and you get approval. We have a review board that looks at your research. You would collect data. You would analyze those data. You'd write this paper, but it would basically be this year of all the little pieces of kind of taking some idea, figuring out how to create something to test that idea, and then sort of seeing what the evidence is for that. But I've had students that have done all different kinds of things. I guess one that I'll note and then maybe pass it to Nigel. I had a thesis student, I think like around 2000, so a long time ago. He was someone, I study stereotyping and prejudice. I usually study how it changes. And he was interested in how stereotypes and prejudices developed in children. So he wanted to go and look at this in kids. So he actually went to a elementary school in town and said, I'll run this after school program. He went in, started this after school program. And we actually published his research. I would never have looked at that. I would never have gone and studied children. I would have been like, oh, it's easier studying college students. But he went and sort of, this was the question he was interested in. He applied things from the class he'd taken with me and pulled me in a different direction than I would have gone.
I think one of the sort of fascinating things about thesis is that it teaches you what you can do, right? And in the sense that it teaches you how much more you can do than you thought you could, right? So this is why it's so important that it's not elective, right? If you elect to do thesis, you know you can do it, right? And the fact is, you know, all of you, when you're done with your junior year here, can do your thesis. And doing the thesis shows you that, right? And that I think it's a wonderful culmination experience.
I think, you know, the thesis, the Hume 110, you know, are some of the key pillars of re-education. The other is this, you know, our philosophy about grading and how we do grades and how we do evaluations.
A few basic things, right? So some people say we don't grade. Okay, we do grade. This is not true, right? What we don't do is immediately share the grades with students in almost every case. I mean, in some cases, it is kind of obvious, right? You know, you're in intro Latin, you have a 20-question test and you get them right. Well, there we go. Sort of obvious what you're doing. But the idea is that I think often if you put a grade on a paper, it actually substitutes for any kind of meaningful feedback that would give you a way to improve yourself, right? So it becomes a way of saying, okay, this paper is at this level, done. Okay, either I need to improve this level or I'm happy with that level, right? And instead, what we focus on is the idea that, everybody should and can get better, right? So if you produce an A paper, well, you really want to stop there. What a waste of time, right? Keep on going, make it better. You can become a better writer. You can become a better thinker. So I mean, in some ways, my comments always have a certain kind of similar shape. It's like, this went well. This is what I want you to do now. And then the next paper, it's like, okay, I asked you to do these things. How did they go? Okay, they went well. So now I want you to do this. It really kind of allows you to sort of, I don't know, draw students onward and upward, right? And students really become focused on self-improvement, not kind of point scoring.
Yeah, it keeps the emphasis on the learning and the acquisition of the information rather than on just the score on that. Certainly in Hum 110, every paper you do, you have a conference with your instructor to go through the feedback from that paper. But even in introductory classes, so in introductory psychology and those introductory labs, I meet with lots of students to walk through. Let's talk through the strengths and weaknesses of your paper. And some of them may want to know, and what kind of grade does that translate into? And I'll say, here's what this translates into. It's not like that. We want to talk about, how do you do a better paper next time? How do you take this foundation and really build on it?
We have a few more questions, and quite a few of them are about having a second major. And it is something that we tell students, it's possible. You might do 2 theses. But how would you advise students who might want to do 2 theses?
You can literally be a double major. So someone could be a theater major and do a theater thesis, and double major and be a psychology major. I actually have had a psychology theater interdisciplinary major where they did a combined major. So they actually devised a production, they wrote a paper, they ran an experiment, they did all of those things. So one can do an interdisciplinary, which means that you're doing both, but it's together. So it's one thesis, but together. So a double major is when you literally do 2 separate majors. So like the physics and psychology, they did all of the stuff with physics, and they did a thesis in physics, and they did all of the stuff with psychology, and they did a thesis in psychology. And they maybe kind of thought of those as 2 separate things that they were interested in. This interdisciplinary major that was in psychology and theater, they thought of the questions that they were interested in were combinations of psychology and theater. So this student, for instance, they were interested in, how do we think about gender identity? And so they did a thesis that was kind of a sensation and perception. They worked with Michael Pitts in psychology, and they did some stuff where they looked at, like, how do we perceive gender? And so they ran an experiment about that. Then they did in the production, they actually had someone whose gender sort of changed within the production. So they were asking the same questions with psychology and theater, and they put it together in one big package. So double major is 2 separate things, and interdisciplinary is where you actually take them and you create something that's new, that's the combination of the 2 things, and you do one thesis that is that combination. There's not a lot of students that do a double major, because to do 2 theses is a lot. We recently now have started having minors. I mean, this is a pretty new thing. We used to just really have majors. I think it's now probably more common that I have a lot of students that will be a psychology major and a Spanish minor, and so then that's, taking a handful of classes in that area to get a minor. So that's certainly something that's becoming more and more popular, because it gives you a way to focus in without actually writing 2 theses and that kind of thing.
The conversation I tend to have with my students is why do you actually want to do 2 majors? So is it because you want to write 2 theses, right? Is it because you think you should have 2 majors because you've got friends from school who are double majors, right? So what you need to think through is kind of, the sort of the intellectual gain you're looking for here, right? So if you want to be a physics and a psychology major, presumably you want to do a lot of physics and a lot of psychology. Do you need to be a major to do that? You need to be a major in one of them because that's a graduation requirement. You don't need to be a major in both. And you can take loads of physics classes.